3 weeks after that pivotal afternoon at Windsor Castle, Charles found himself in a situation he hadn't experienced in over a year, waiting for a phone call from both of his sons. They had agreed to a weekly family conference call, a modern solution to an ancient problem that would have amused Philip to no end. The first call had been awkward, filled with careful pleasantries and updates on the children. The second had been better, with William sharing a funny story about Lewis's latest escapade and Harry describing Archie's obsession with dinosaurs. By the third week, they were actually discussing substantive matters: William's upcoming environmental initiatives and Harry's mental health advocacy work. But it was during the fourth call that the real progress became evident. William had called Harry separately the night before to ask for advice about a speech he was writing on military mental health. Harry had offered to review the draft and suggest edits based on his own experiences with veteran support organizations. It was a small collaboration, but Charles recognized its significance. His sons were beginning to see each other as resources rather than rivals. The changes weren't limited to phone calls. Catherine had started including Meghan in text message conversations about family photos and milestone celebrations. When Lilibet took her first steps, Meghan had shared the video with her sister-in-law before posting it anywhere else. These were tiny gestures, but they represented a fundamental shift in how the family was choosing to communicate. Charles had been particularly moved when he received a joint birthday card from both couples. The image on the front was a photograph taken at Balmoral years earlier, showing him walking between his young sons while all three of them pointed at something in the distance. Inside, the message was simple: "Thank you for always pointing us toward home. Love, William, Catherine, Harry, Meghan, and all the grandchildren." The real test came when the Queen announced her intention to celebrate her Platinum Jubilee with a family gathering at Sandringham. For the first time since Harry and Meghan had stepped back from royal duties, the entire family would be together for a private celebration rather than a state occasion. Charles had been designated as the unofficial coordinator for the event, a role that required diplomatic skills he hadn't known he possessed. Balancing schedules, managing expectations, and ensuring that everyone felt comfortable with the arrangements proved to be more complex than organizing most state visits. The breakthrough came when Harry called him unexpectedly one evening, not for the scheduled family call but for a private conversation. "I've been thinking about grandfather's funeral," Harry said without preamble. "About how we all managed to put our differences aside for him. I keep wondering why we needed a funeral to remember how to be a family." Charles set aside the papers he had been reviewing and gave his son his full attention. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that maybe we've been approaching this backward," Harry continued. "Instead of trying to solve our problems and then come together, maybe we should come together and let the problems solve themselves." It was a surprisingly mature observation from his youngest son, and Charles felt a familiar surge of pride. "What does that look like practically?" "I want to bring Meghan and the children for the Jubilee celebration," Harry said. "Not as returning royals, not as representatives of the monarchy, but as family members who happen to live far away." The distinction was important, and Charles understood it immediately. Harry wasn't asking to resume his former role or make any grand gestures toward the institution of monarchy. He was simply asking to be welcomed home as a son and brother. "And you think Meghan would be comfortable with that?" "She wants to try," Harry said quietly. "She misses Catherine more than she admits. And she wants the children to know their cousins properly, not just through video calls and photographs." Charles spent the next several days having delicate conversations with various family members. The Queen was immediately supportive, declaring that nothing would make her happier than having all her great-grandchildren together for the celebration. William was more cautious but ultimately positive, especially when Catherine expressed enthusiasm for the reunion. The logistics proved challenging. Security arrangements had to be updated, sleeping accommodations needed to be reorganized, and, most importantly, clear boundaries had to be established about media access and public expectations. This would be a private family gathering, not a photo opportunity or a public relations exercise. 2 days before the Jubilee weekend, Charles received another unexpected call, this time from William. "I've been working on something," his eldest son said. "A surprise for the Queen. But I need Harry's help to pull it off properly." William had been secretly organizing a photo project, collecting pictures from family members around the world to create a comprehensive visual history of the Queen's 70 years on the throne. He had images from official engagements and state visits, but he was missing the personal family moments that would make the project truly special. "Harry has access to photos from our childhood that I can't find in the official archives," William explained. "And Meghan has some beautiful candid shots from recent family gatherings that we never shared publicly." The collaboration that followed was more extensive than either brother had initially planned. They spent hours on video calls, sorting through decades of family photographs, debating which images best captured the Queen's role as grandmother and great-grandmother alongside her duties as monarch. The project became a catalyst for dozens of shared memories. Looking at pictures of family holidays triggered stories about their grandfather's practical jokes, their grandmother's unexpected sense of humor, and their own childhood adventures. By the time they finished compiling the photo collection, they had also begun rebuilding the foundation of their relationship. The Jubilee weekend itself exceeded everyone's expectations. Meghan and the children arrived on Friday afternoon, and, within hours, it was as if the last 2 years of separation had never happened. Archie immediately attached himself to his cousin George, while Lilibet charmed everyone with her fearless exploration of Sandringham's vast rooms and corridors. The adults found their rhythm more gradually, but Charles was struck by how naturally old patterns reasserted themselves. William and Harry automatically fell into their childhood roles during family games, with William organizing teams and strategies while Harry provided entertainment and comic relief. Meghan and Catherine picked up their friendship as if no time had passed, sharing stories about their children's latest developments and laughing at inside jokes Charles didn't entirely understand. The Queen herself seemed rejuvenated by having all her family together. Charles watched her with the great-grandchildren, marveling at how effortlessly she shifted between being the head of the Commonwealth and being a great-grandmother who was perfectly willing to crawl on the floor to retrieve a toy from under a sofa. The photo presentation took place on Sunday morning, with William and Harry jointly revealing the project they had created. The Queen's reaction was everything they could have hoped for: tears of joy, exclamations of surprise at forgotten moments captured on film, and requests to see certain pictures again and again. But the most meaningful moment came during the final family dinner, when the Queen raised her glass and offered a toast that surprised everyone. "To my family," she said simply. "All of you, wherever you choose to make your homes, whatever paths you choose to follow. You are loved not for what you do, but for who you are." The words were directed at everyone present, but Charles knew they carried special significance for Harry and Meghan, who had spent 2 years wondering if their choices had made them unwelcome. As the weekend drew to a close, Charles found himself reflecting on the journey his family had traveled. The rift between his sons hadn't been healed overnight, and there would undoubtedly be challenges ahead as they continued to navigate their different roles and responsibilities. But the foundation of love and shared history that had always existed beneath their conflicts had been rediscovered and strengthened. The farewell at the airport was emotional but not desperate. Plans were already in motion for William and Catherine to visit California during the summer, and Harry and Meghan were committed to regular returns to England for family occasions. As Charles watched his younger son's family board their plane, he thought about the conversation that had started this process. Philip had been right, as usual, about the importance of choosing action over resignation, hope over acceptance. The work of maintaining family relationships across continents and differences would be ongoing, requiring constant effort and good faith from everyone involved. But Charles now believed that effort would be freely given. They had remembered who they were to each other beneath all the titles and expectations and public pressures. Later that evening, as Charles walked through the now quiet rooms of Sandringham, he paused in the library where his father used to read to him as a child. Philip's chair stood empty, but his wisdom lived on in the choices his family continued to make. Family, Charles reflected, was not a problem to be solved but a living thing that required tending and care. This weekend had reminded them all that some bonds, once properly nurtured, could survive any distance and overcome any misunderstanding. The future would bring its own challenges, but they would face them together, as they always should have. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with a message from Harry: "Thank you for everything this weekend. The children are already asking when we can come home again." Charles smiled as he typed his response, home is always here when you need it. It was a simple exchange, but it carried the weight of reconciliation and the promise of continued connection. Philip would have been proud of them all, Charles thought. They had chosen love over pride, understanding over judgment, and hope over despair. They had chosen to be a family. The next afternoon arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to seep through the stone walls of Windsor Castle. Charles had chosen the oak drawing room for their meeting, a space intimate enough for honest conversation but formal enough to remind them all of their shared heritage. He arrived early, adjusting the placement of chairs 3 times before settling on an arrangement that wouldn't favor any particular person. William was the first to arrive, punctual as always. He wore a navy sweater over dark trousers, having abandoned the formality of yesterday's funeral attire for something that suggested this was family time, not a royal engagement. But Charles could see the tension in his eldest son's shoulders, the careful way he held himself as if preparing for battle rather than tea. "Any word from Harry?" William asked, glancing toward the window that overlooked the long walk. "He'll be here," Charles said with more confidence than he felt. In truth, he hadn't heard from Harry since their phone call, and a small part of him wondered if his younger son might simply choose not to appear. 20 minutes past the agreed time, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Both men turned toward the door as Harry appeared, escorted by a discreet protection officer who immediately withdrew. Harry paused in the doorway, and, for a moment Charles saw not the 36-year-old man who had given interviews about his family's failings, but the 12-year-old boy who used to hesitate before entering rooms full of adults who expected him to be charming and composed. Harry had also dressed down from yesterday's formality, wearing dark jeans and a gray sweater that Catherine had given him several Christmases ago. The sight of it gave Charles an unexpected pang of hope. Surely Harry wouldn't have chosen to wear something connected to William's wife if he intended to maintain complete hostility. "Harry," Charles said, rising from his chair. "Thank you for coming." "William," Harry nodded to his brother, his voice carefully neutral. "Harry." The greeting between the brothers lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but Charles felt the weight of every unspoken word in that brief exchange. He gestured toward the tea service that had been prepared on a low table between 3 armchairs. "Shall we sit?" The first 10 minutes were carefully polite, filled with observations about the weather and the previous day's ceremony. Harry asked about the Queen's health, William inquired about Meghan and the children. They could have been distant cousins catching up at a family gathering rather than brothers who had once shared every secret. Charles let them navigate these safe waters while he poured tea and offered biscuits, playing the role of host while secretly analyzing every gesture and tone. Harry sat slightly forward in his chair, as if ready to leave at any moment. William had chosen the chair closest to the window, perhaps unconsciously positioning himself with an escape route. "Grandfather would have hated this," Harry said suddenly, breaking through the polite small talk. "All this tiptoeing around each other." William's cup rattled slightly against its saucer as he set it down. "You're right. He would have told us to stop being idiots and sort ourselves out." "He did tell me that, actually," Harry said, and both Charles and William looked at him in surprise. "The last time I saw him. He said family grudges were a luxury we couldn't afford." Charles felt his throat tighten. Philip had never mentioned that conversation, but it sounded exactly like something his father would have said. "When was this?" William asked. "Last summer, when I came back for the statue unveiling." Harry's voice softened. He was friendlier than I expected, but his mind was still sharp. "He asked me if I thought our mother would be proud of how we were treating each other." The mention of Diana hung in the air like incense, sacred and heavy. Charles watched his sons' faces change, saw the careful walls they had built begin to show cracks. William was the first to break. "I miss talking to you," he said quietly. "When Charlotte started school, I wanted to call you. You always knew exactly what to say when I was nervous about something." Harry's composure wavered. "I wanted to call when Archie said his first word. It was Willie, which seemed like either a sign or the universe playing a cruel joke." Despite everything, William smiled at that. "What did Meghan say?" "She said maybe it was time to stop being so stubborn and pick up the phone." Harry's own smile was rueful. But then, another story would come out in the papers, or someone would make a statement, and the moment would pass. Charles had remained silent during this exchange, recognizing that his sons needed to find their own way back to each other. But now he felt compelled to speak. "You've both been protecting yourselves," he said carefully. "And your families. No one can fault you for that. But perhaps you've been protecting yourselves from each other as well." William stood abruptly and walked to the window. "It's not that simple, Father. Trust, once broken, can be rebuilt," Harry finished quietly. "If both people want it badly enough." "Do you?" William asked without turning around. "Want it badly enough?" The question hung between them, loaded with months of hurt and years of accumulated resentment. Charles held his breath, knowing that everything depended on Harry's answer. "I never stopped wanting my brother back," Harry said finally. "Even when I was angriest, even when I felt like you had chosen the institution over me, I never stopped missing you." William turned from the window, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I thought you had chosen America over us. Over me." "I chose happiness over duty," Harry said. "But I never meant to choose distance from you." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Charles had witnessed in years. His sons talked about the pressure they had both felt growing up in the shadow of their mother's death, about the different ways they had learned to cope with public scrutiny, about the impossible balance between personal happiness and royal obligation. They talked about the night Diana died, and how Harry had blamed himself for years because she had been on her way to see him when the accident happened. William revealed that he had carried similar guilt, believing that if he had been a better older brother, Harry wouldn't have needed their mother's comfort that night. They discussed the Oprah interview with an honesty that surprised Charles. Harry acknowledged that some of his words had been harsher than necessary, spoken from a place of pain rather than measured consideration. William admitted that he had been hurt not just by what Harry said, but by learning about his brother's struggles through television rather than through private conversation. "I should have called you when things got bad," Harry said. "Before they got so bad that leaving seemed like the only option." "I should have made it easier for you to call," William replied. "I got so caught up in defending the family that I forgot to defend my brother." As the afternoon wore on, Charles found himself thinking about his own relationship with his siblings, about the petty rivalries and jealousies that had marked his own youth. Every family had its share of misunderstandings and hurt feelings, but few families had to navigate those challenges under the constant scrutiny of the global media. The breakthrough came when William asked about Harry's therapy sessions, something he would never have done publicly but approached with genuine curiosity in the privacy of their father's sitting room. "It's helped," Harry said simply. "Learning to recognize my own patterns, understanding why certain situations trigger certain responses. I wish I had started years ago." "Maybe we all should have," William mused. "God knows growing up in this family doesn't come with an instruction manual." "Speak for yourself," Charles interjected with mock offense. "I gave you both very detailed instructions. You just rarely followed them." The shared laughter that followed was tentative but real, the first genuine moment of humor they had shared in over a year. Charles seized on it, suggesting they walk through the gardens before Harry's departure. The three men spent the next hour strolling through the grounds where Harry and William had played as children. They passed the rose garden where Diana had often brought them for picnics, the pond where they had learned to fish under Philip's patient instruction, the old oak tree where they had built an elaborate treehouse that had been demolished for security reasons when they became teenagers. Each location sparked memories, and, with the memories came a gradual relaxation of the formal distance they had maintained. By the time they returned to the castle, William and Harry were walking closer together, their conversation flowing more naturally. As they reached the entrance, Harry's protection officer approached discreetly to inform him that his car was ready. The moment they had all been avoiding was finally at hand. "This doesn't fix everything," William said as they stood in the courtyard. "We have a lot more talking to do." "But it's a start," Harry agreed. "A good start." The brothers embraced then, briefly but sincerely, and Charles felt something tight in his chest finally release. They had a long way to go, and there would undoubtedly be setbacks and difficult conversations ahead. But, for the first time in months, he believed they would find their way back to each other. As Harry's car pulled away, William remained standing beside his father, both men watching until the vehicle disappeared from view. "Thank you," William said quietly, "for making us do this." "I didn't make you do anything," Charles replied. "I just provided the opportunity. You and Harry did the hard work." As they walked back into the castle together, Charles reflected on the lessons of the day. Healing family wounds required courage from everyone involved, but it also required someone willing to create the space for that courage to flourish. Today had been a beginning, not an ending, but sometimes beginnings were more precious than conclusions. The morning sun cast long shadows across Windsor Castle as Prince Charles stood at his bedroom window, watching the last of the funeral guests depart. The Duke of Edinburgh's funeral had ended just hours ago, but the weight of the day seemed to press down on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. At 72, Charles had attended many solemn occasions, but saying goodbye to his father while knowing his own sons barely spoke to each other felt like carrying two burdens at once. The funeral service had been everything Philip would have wanted: dignified, military in precision, and mercifully brief. Yet Charles couldn't shake the image that had haunted him throughout the ceremony: Harry and William walking behind their grandfather's coffin, separated by their cousin Peter Phillips, their faces masks of grief and careful control. The physical distance between his sons seemed to mirror the emotional chasm that had opened between them over the past year. Charles remembered a time when Harry and William were inseparable. As children, they would race through these same castle corridors, their laughter echoing off ancient stone walls. William, always the responsible older brother, would patiently explain royal protocols to Harry, who would listen with wide eyes before promptly forgetting everything in favor of some new adventure. Those days felt like stories from another lifetime now. The trouble had been brewing for years, but it had exploded into public view when Harry and Meghan stepped back from their royal duties. Charles had watched helplessly as newspaper headlines dissected every family conversation, every perceived slight, every moment of tension. The Oprah interview had been the final straw for William, who felt his family had been unfairly portrayed to millions of viewers worldwide. Catherine, William's wife, had tried to bridge the gap during the funeral reception. Charles had watched her approach Harry with genuine warmth, her hand briefly touching his arm as they exchanged quiet words. For a moment, hope had flickered in Charles's chest. But then, Harry had stepped back, his polite smile not quite reaching his eyes, and the moment had passed. As evening approached, Charles found himself in his study, staring at his father's empty chair. Philip had always been direct about family matters, never one to dance around difficult conversations. "Get them talking," he could almost hear his father saying in that no-nonsense tone. "Whatever's broken between those boys, it won't fix itself." The Prince of Wales reached for his phone, hesitating only briefly before scrolling to William's number. His eldest son answered on the second ring, his voice tired but alert. "Father? Is everything all right?" "I was hoping we might talk," Charles said carefully. "About today? About Harry?" There was a long pause. Charles could hear voices in the background, Catherine speaking softly to the children, the ordinary sounds of family life that seemed so precious now. "I know what you're thinking," William said finally. "But some things can't be fixed with a conversation." "Your grandfather believed most things could be fixed with honesty and time," Charles replied. "He was rarely wrong about family matters." Another silence stretched between them. Charles waited, knowing his son well enough to recognize the internal struggle William was facing. The future king was caught between his sense of duty to the monarchy and his feelings of betrayal by his younger brother. "Harry made his choice when he left," William said, but Charles detected uncertainty beneath the firmness. "When he decided to air our private business to the world. He also lost his grandfather today," Charles said gently. "Just as you did. Just as I did." The line went quiet again, but Charles didn't fill the silence. Sometimes the most important conversations happened in the spaces between words. "What exactly are you suggesting?" William asked eventually. Charles took a deep breath. "I'm suggesting that tomorrow, we invite Harry for tea. Just the three of us. No media, no staff taking notes, no agendas beyond being a family. He's flying back to California tomorrow. Then, we ask him to stay one more day." William's skepticism was audible. And, you think he'll agree to that? I think he's as tired of this distance as we are, Charles said, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. I think he loved your grandfather as much as any of us, and I think he's learned some hard lessons about what really matters. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with William raising practical concerns and Charles addressing each one with patience. By the end, they had agreed to extend the invitation, though William's enthusiasm remained carefully contained. After ending the call, Charles immediately dialed Harry's number. His younger son's voice was guarded when he answered, the warmth Charles remembered from childhood now buried under layers of hurt and caution. "Father. Harry. How are you holding up?" "It's been a difficult day for all of us," Harry replied diplomatically. Charles could picture his son in some quiet corner of Frogmore Cottage, probably still wearing his military medals from the funeral, probably feeling very alone despite being surrounded by security personnel. "I was wondering if you might postpone your flight home," Charles said without preamble. "William and I would like to have tea with you tomorrow. Just us." The request clearly caught Harry off guard. Charles heard a sharp intake of breath, then nothing for several long seconds. "Is this about grandfather's will?" Harry asked carefully. "This is about his grandsons," Charles said firmly. "And his son who would very much like to see his boys in the same room without a funeral as the reason." Harry's response came slowly, each word carefully measured. "I don't know if that's a good idea, Father. Things have been said, things that can't be taken back. Your grandfather never believed in dwelling on things that couldn't be changed," Charles said. He was much more interested in what could be built going forward. The silence that followed was different from William's pauses, heavier, more fragmented. Charles could sense his younger son wrestling with old wounds and new possibilities. "Would William actually want me there?" Harry asked finally, and the vulnerability in his voice made Charles's heart ache. "He's the one who suggested we make it the three of us," Charles lied smoothly, knowing that sometimes small deceptions served larger truths. When Harry finally agreed to stay another day, Charles felt something ease in his chest that he hadn't even realized was tight. The conversation ended with tentative plans for the following afternoon, and Charles found himself alone again in his study, but the solitude felt different now, less like isolation and more like the quiet before something important begins. Outside his window, the lights of Windsor Great Park twinkled like earthbound stars. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but, for the first time in months, Charles allowed himself to hope that his family might find its way back to each other. Philip would have approved of the direct approach, he thought. His father had always believed that the hardest conversations were usually the most necessary ones. The Prince of Wales spent the rest of the evening making careful preparations, not for a state occasion or a public appearance, but for something far more important and infinitely more delicate, the first real conversation between his sons in over a year. Everything would depend on what happened in those first few minutes when Harry walked into the room. Everything would depend on whether love could bridge the gap that pride and pain had created. As midnight approached, Charles finally left his study, but sleep would not come easily. Tomorrow would either mark the beginning of healing or confirm that some rifts run too deep to mend. Either way, he had done what his father would have expected. He had chosen hope over resignation, action over acceptance. The rest was up to Harry and William, and to whatever remained of the bond that had once made them inseparable.